You've purchased or opened your pharmacy 5 or 10 years ago or more. You have worked hard. You have missed more of your kids' Christmas concerts and piano recitals than you would like to admit. You have stood patiently behind your pharmacy counter as your 75-year-old patient tells you all about her last vacation down south, from the resort she stayed at to the colors of her bathing suits. You've worked hard, and now you want to reap the rewards. You want to sell your pharmacy. You find yourself in my office telling me, Marianne, I want to sell my pharmacy. It is time, and I found a great purchaser, and I want you to help me to get to the finish line. I want to do it the right way. You want to know how to sell your pharmacy the right way? Stay tuned. On this episode, we'll be discussing the legal implications of selling and purchasing pharmacies. Stay with me. Welcome to this episode. I'm Marianne Keriakos, a lawyer who specializes in providing legal services to pharmacists and pharmacy owners in Ontario. As I previously mentioned, we'll be discussing today the purchase and sale of pharmacies and their legal implications. The first step is to decide whether you're going to sell and or purchase assets or shares of a corporation. If you're selling your pharmacy, it may be beneficial to sell shares. There are tax benefits to selling shares, such as the capital gains tax exemption that would provide you with around $900,000 tax-free. Again, that is something you want to discuss with your accountant. If you're purchasing the pharmacy, then you may want to purchase assets and not shares. The reason being that if you purchase assets, then you don't assume the liability of the corporation that owns the pharmacy. When you buy the shares, then you assume the liability of that corporation that owns the pharmacy. That means that if there's, for example, a lawsuit for a slip and fall or a dispensing error and the patient is suing the pharmacy, or any matter involving the actual corporation, a CRA audit, for example, then you may be liable. If you do purchase the shares of the corporation, then you assume the liability of that corporation. So you may want to go ahead and do a purchase of assets instead. However, having said this, if you do decide to purchase the shares, then you may be able to negotiate the price down a little bit because in exchange, the seller is getting tax benefits for that sale of shares. Now, if you are purchasing shares, another point that I always recommend to my clients is a holdback of around 10% of the purchase price. The reason being, as we discussed previously, when you are buying shares, you are assuming the liability of the corporation that is owning the pharmacy, and so we keep that holdback that is put in the purchaser's lawyer's trust account for a year or two, and it is somewhat of a security in the event that there are any issues and any liabilities that we were unaware of. Then we can use this holdback to compensate the purchaser. Now let's talk about the conditions to include in a purchase and sale agreement. I like to divide them into two sections. There are the pre-closing conditions and there are the closing conditions. The pre-closing conditions have a timeline, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after you sign, both purchaser and seller, the purchase and sale agreement. After that time, or after that deadline, then the purchaser has to waive the pre-closing conditions. The closing conditions, they can stay with us until the date of the closing. We can go ahead and waive them before, but they can stay up to the date of closing. What are the pre-closing conditions? The standard pre-closing conditions we see in purchase and sale agreements are the financing condition, the lease condition, where the purchaser basically has to review and approve the lease terms, and the due diligence condition. We also may have a solicitor's condition, which allows the vendors and the purchasers' lawyers to review the purchase and sale agreement and basically give their stamp of approval in regards to the terms of the purchase and sale agreement. Then we have the closing conditions. They include, of course, the landlord's consent to assign the lease to the purchaser. We put that as a closing condition because it does take some time, and we also don't want to involve the landlord right from the get-go, right from the beginning. We want to wait until the pre-closing conditions have been waived by the purchaser to then get the landlord involved. We also have the OCP accreditation and ODB approval, and if the pharmacy has a banner agreement, then we also have to make sure that the banner, if there is a right of first refusal in this agreement, that the banner does go ahead and waive its right of first refusal. Now let's talk about the deposit. Now, if you're the purchaser, you want to be able to get your deposit back in the event the deal does not close. If you're the seller, you want to make sure also that the purchaser doesn't waste your time and doesn't basically keep you hanging for a month or 2 or 3 or sometimes more than that. And so you do want to make sure to put in there that, you know, in the event that the deal does not go through, after the purchaser went ahead and waived the pre-closing conditions and time has passed, then you would be entitled to the deposit, or at least a part of it, just so that you get compensated for basically being put on hold for that long. A crucial clause in a purchase and sale agreement is the non-competition / non-solicitation agreement. The purchaser, of course, is going to want the seller and the seller's principals to sign a non-competition, non-solicitation agreement. The exact terms of that non-competition, non-solicitation agreement is to be negotiated between the parties, but one very important tip is to not just include the seller, the corporation, and the principals of the pharmacy, but to also put in there all the shareholders of the corporation as well as key employees, especially if the owner of the pharmacy is not the one managing the pharmacy or working inside the pharmacy. Another very important clause to include in the purchase and sale agreement is the indemnity clause. The seller is to indemnify the purchaser is to indemnify the seller. That means that the seller can go after the purchaser for any claims post the closing date. The purchaser can go after the seller and be compensated by the seller for anything prior to the closing date. This is very important, especially in a purchase of shares. You want to make sure that the sellers remain liable for any matter up to the date of closing. Very important. And also the sellers, they do want to go ahead and make sure that the purchasers are then liable for any matter involving post-closing. One last point I wanted to discuss was employees. If you're buying a pharmacy, please make sure that the seller goes ahead and dismisses the employees and pays them all amounts that is owed to them. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. I hope this was helpful. On the next episode, we will be discussing how to find pharmacies for sale, how to finance pharmacies, how to determine the fair market value of a pharmacy. So stay tuned for our next episode. Thanks for joining me.